Cross Purposes. By George MacDonald. Cross Purposes, The Shadows Cross Purposes, Chapter 1. Once upon a time, the Queen of Fairyland, finding her own subjects far too well behaved to be amusing, took a sudden longing to have a mortal or two at her court. So, after looking about her for some time, she fixed upon two to bring to Fairyland. But how were they to be brought? "Please your Majesty," said at last the daughter of the Prime Minister, "I will bring the girl." The speaker, whose name was Peas Blossom, after her great-great-grandmother, looked so graceful, and hung her head so apologetically, that the Queen said at once, "How will you manage it, Peas Blossom?" "I will open the road before her, and close it behind her. I have heard that you have pretty ways of doing things, so you may try." The court happened to be held in an open forest glade of smooth turf, upon which there was just one mole-heap. As soon as the Queen had given her permission to Peas Blossom, up through the mole-heap came the head of a goblin, which cried out, "Please your Majesty, I will bring the boy." "You!" exclaimed the Queen. "How will you do it?" The goblin began to wriggle himself out of the earth, as if he had been a snake, and the whole world his skin, till the court was convulsed with laughter. As soon as he got free, he began to roll over and over, in every possible manner, rotatory and cylindrical, all at once, until he reached the wood. The courtiers followed, holding their sides so that the Queen was left sitting upon her throne in solitary state. When they reached the wood, the goblin, whose name was Toadstool, was nowhere to be seen. While they were looking for him, out popped his head from the mole-heap again, with the words, "So, your Majesty, you have taken your own time to answer," said the Queen, laughing. "And my own way too, eh?" "Your Majesty?" rejoined Toadstool, grinning. "No doubt. Well, you may try." And the goblin, making as much of a bow as he could with only half his neck above ground, disappeared under it. Chapter 2. No mortal, or fairy either, can tell where Fairyland begins and where it ends. But somewhere on the borders of Fairyland there was a nice country village, in which lived some nice country people. Alice was the daughter of the squire, a pretty, good-natured girl, whom her friends called fairy-like, and others called silly. One rosy summer evening, when the wall opposite her window was flaked all over with rosiness, she threw herself down on her bed, and lay gazing at the wall. The rose-color sank through her eyes and dyed her brain, and she began to feel as if she were reading a storybook. She thought she was looking at a western sea, with the waves all red with sunset. But when the color died out, Alice gave a sigh to see how commonplace the wall grew. "I wish it was always sunset," she said half aloud. "I don't like gray things." "I will take you where the sun is always setting, if you like, Alice," said a sweet, tiny voice near her. She looked down on the coverlet of the bed, and there, looking up at her, stood a lovely little creature. It seemed quite natural that the little lady should be there, for many things we never could believe have only to happen, and then there is nothing strange about them. She was dressed in white, with a cloak of sunset red, the colors of the sweetest of sweet peas. On her head was a crown of twisted tendrils, with a little gold beetle in front. "Are you a fairy?" said Alice. "Yes." "Will you go with me to the sunset?" "Yes, I will." When Alice proceeded to rise, she found that she was no bigger than the fairy, and when she stood up on the counterpane, the bed looked like a great hall with a painted ceiling. As she walked towards Peas Blossom, she stumbled several times over the tufts that made the pattern. But the fairy took her by the hand and led her towards the foot of the bed. Long before they reached it, however, Alice saw that the fairy was a tall, slender lady, and that she herself was quite her own size. What she had taken for tufts on the counterpane were really bushes of furze, and broom, and heather on the side of a slope. "Where are we?" asked Alice. "Going on," answered the fairy. Alice, not liking the reply, said, "I want to go home." "Goodbye, then," answered the fairy. Alice looked round. A wide, hilly country lay all about them. She could not even tell from what quarter they had come. "I must go with you, I see," she said. Before they reached the bottom, they were walking over the loveliest meadow grass. A little stream went cantering down beside them, without channel or bank, sometimes running between the blades, sometimes sweeping the grass all one way under it. And it made a great babbling for such a little stream and such a smooth course. Gradually the slope grew gentler, and the stream flowed more softly and spread out wider. At length they came to a wood of long, straight poplars, growing out of the water, for the stream ran into the wood, and there stretched out into a lake. Alice thought they could go no farther, but Peas Blossom led her straight on, and they walked through. It was now dark, but everything under the water gave out a pale, quiet light. There were deep pools here and there, but there was no mud, or frogs, or water lizards, or eels. All the bottom was pure, lovely grass, brilliantly green. Down the banks of the pools she saw, all under water, primroses and violets and pimpernels. Any flower she wished to see she had only to look for, and she was sure to find it. When a pool came in their way, the fairy swam, and Alice swam by her, and when they got out they were quite dry, though the water was as delightfully wet as water should be. Besides the trees, tall, splendid lilies grew out of it, and hollyhocks and irises and sword plants, and many other long-stemmed flowers. From every leaf and petal of these, from every branch tip and tendril, dropped bright water. It gathered slowly at each point, but the points were so many that there was a constant musical plashing of diamond rain upon the still surface of the lake. As they went on, the moon rose and threw a pale mist of light over the whole, and the diamond drops turned to half-liquid pearls, and round every tree-top was a halo of moonlight, and the water went to sleep, and the flowers began to dream. "Look," said the fairy, "those lilies are just dreaming themselves into a child's sleep. I can see them smiling. This is the place out of which go the things that appear to children every night." "Is this dreamland, then?" asked Alice. "If you like," answered the fairy. "How far am I from home?" "The farther you go, the nearer home you are." Then the fairy lady gathered a bundle of poppies and gave it to Alice. The next deep pool that they came to, she told her to throw it in. Alice did so, and following it, laid her head upon it. That moment she began to sink. Down and down she went, till at last she felt herself lying on the long, thick grass at the bottom of the pool, with the poppies under her head and the clear water high over it. Up through it she saw the moon, whose bright face looked sleepy too, disturbed only by the little ripples of the rain from the tall flowers on the edges of the pool. She fell fast asleep, and all night dreamed about home. Chapter 3. Richard, which is name enough for a fairy story, was the son of a widow in Alice's village. He was so poor that he did not find himself generally welcome, so he hardly went anywhere, but read books at home, and waited upon his mother. His manners, therefore, were shy, and sufficiently awkward to give an unfavorable impression to those who looked at outsides. Alice would have despised him, but he never came near enough for that. Now Richard had been saving up his few pence in order to buy an umbrella for his mother, for the winter would come, and the one she had was almost torn to ribbons. One bright summer evening, when he thought umbrellas must be cheap, he was walking across the marketplace to buy one. There, in the middle of it, stood an odd-looking little man, actually selling umbrellas. Here was a chance for him. When he drew nearer, he found that the little man, while vaunting his umbrellas to the skies, was asking such absurdly small prices for them, that no one would venture to buy one. He had opened and laid them all out at full stretch on the marketplace, about 25 of them, stick downwards, like little tents, and he stood beside, haranguing the people. But he would not allow one of the crowd to touch his umbrellas. As soon as his eye fell upon Richard, he changed his tone, and said, "Well, as nobody seems inclined to buy, I think, my dear umbrellas, we had better be going home." Whereupon the umbrellas got up, with some difficulty, and began hobbling away. The people stared at each other with open mouths, for they saw that what they had taken for a lot of umbrellas was in reality a flock of black geese. A great turkey cock went gobbling behind them, driving them all down a lane towards the forest. Richard thought with himself, "There is more in this than I can account for. But an umbrella that could lay eggs would be a very jolly umbrella." So by the time the people were beginning to laugh at each other, Richard was halfway down the lane at the heels of the geese. There he stooped and caught one of them, but instead of a goose he had a huge hedgehog in his hands, which he dropped in dismay, whereupon it waddled away a goose as before, and the whole of them began cackling and hissing in a way that he could not mistake. For the turkey cock, he gobbled and gabbled and choked himself and got right again in the most ridiculous manner. In fact, he seemed sometimes to forget that he was a turkey, and laugh like a fool. All at once, with a simultaneous long-necked hiss, they flew into the wood, and the turkey after them. But Richard soon got up with them again, and found them all hanging by their feet from the trees, in 2 rows, one on each side of the path, while the turkey was walking on. Him Richard followed, but the moment he reached the middle of the suspended geese, from every side arose the most frightful hisses, and their necks grew longer and longer, till there were nearly 30 broad bills close to his head, blowing in his face, in his ears, and at the back of his neck. But the turkey, looking round and seeing what was going on, turned and walked back. When he reached the place, he leapt up at the first and gobbled at him in the wildest manner. That goose grew silent and dropped from the tree. Then he went to the next, and so on, till he had gobbled them all off the trees, one after another. But when Richard expected to see them go after the turkey, there was nothing there but a flock of huge mushrooms and puff balls. "I have had enough of this," thought Richard. "I will go home again." "Go home, Richard," said a voice close to him. Looking down, he saw, instead of the turkey, the most comical-looking little man he had ever seen. "Go home, Master Richard," repeated he, grinning. "Not for your bidding," answered Richard. "Come on, then, Master Richard." "Nor that either, without a good reason. I will give you such an umbrella for your mother. I don't take presents from strangers. Bless you, I'm no stranger here." "Oh, no!" "Not at all." And he set off in the manner usual with him, rolling every way at once. Richard could not help laughing and following. At length Toadstool plumped into a great hole full of water. "Served him right," thought Richard. "Served him right," bawled the goblin, crawling out again, and shaking the water from him like a spaniel. "This is the very place I wanted, only I rolled too fast." However, he went on rolling again faster than before, though it was now uphill, till he came to the top of a considerable height, on which grew a number of palm trees. "Have you a knife, Richard?" said the goblin, stopping all at once, as if he had been walking quietly along, just like other people. Richard pulled out a pocket knife and gave it to the creature, who instantly cut a deep gash in one of the trees. Then he bounded to another and did the same, and so on till he had gashed them all. Richard, following him, saw that a little stream, clearer than the clearest water, began to flow from each, increasing in size the longer it flowed. Before he had reached the last there was quite a tinkling and rustling of the little rills that ran down the stems of the palms. This grew and grew, till Richard saw that a full rivulet was flowing down the side of the hill. "Here is your knife, Richard," said the goblin, but by the time he had put it in his pocket, the rivulet had grown to a small torrent. "Now, Richard, come along," said Toadstool, and threw himself into the torrent. "I would rather have a boat," returned Richard. "Oh, you stupid!" cried Toadstool, crawling up the side of the hill, down which the stream had already carried him some distance. With every contortion that labor and difficulty could suggest, yet with incredible rapidity, he crawled to the very top of one of the trees, and tore down a huge leaf, which he threw on the ground, and himself after it, rebounding like a ball. He then laid the leaf on the water, held it by the stem, and told Richard to get upon it. He did so. It went down deep in the middle with his weight. Toadstool let it go, and it shot down the stream like an arrow. This began the strangest and most delightful voyage. The stream rushed careering and curveting down the hillside, bright as a diamond, and soon reached a meadow plain. The goblin rolled alongside of the boat like a bundle of weeds, but Richard rode in triumph through the low grassy country upon the back of his watery steed. It went straight as an arrow, and, strange to tell, was heaped up on the ground, like a ridge of water or a wave, only rushing on endways. It needed no channel, and turned aside for no opposition. It flowed over everything that crossed its path, like a great serpent of water, with folds fitting into all the ups and downs of the way. If a wall came in its course it flowed against it, heaping itself up on itself till it reached the top, whence it plunged to the foot on the other side, and flowed on. Soon he found that it was running gently up a grassy hill. The waves kept curling back as if the wind blew them, or as if they could hardly keep from running down again. But still the stream mounted and flowed, and the waves with it. It found it difficult, but it could do it. When they reached the top, it bore them across a heathy country, rolling over purple heather, and blue harebells, and delicate ferns, and tall foxgloves crowded with bells purple and white. All the time the palm leaf curled its edges away from the water, and made a delightful boat for Richard, while Toadstool tumbled along in the stream like a porpoise. At length the water began to run very fast, and went faster and faster, till suddenly it plunged them into a deep lake, with a great splash, and stopped there. Toadstool went out of sight, and came up gasping and grinning, while Richard's boat tossed and heaved like a vessel in a storm at sea, but not a drop of water came in. Then the goblin began to swim, and pushed and tugged the boat along. But the lake was so still, and the motion so pleasant, that Richard fell fast asleep. Chapter 4. When he woke, he found himself still afloat upon the broad palm leaf. He was alone in the middle of a lake, with flowers and trees growing in and out of it everywhere. The sun was just over the treetops. A drip of water from the flowers greeted him with music. The mists were dissolving away, and where the sunlight fell on the lake the water was clear as glass. Casting his eyes downward, he saw, just beneath him, far down at the bottom, Alice drowned, as he thought. He was in the act of plunging in, when he saw her open her eyes, and at the same moment begin to float up. He held out his hand, but she repelled it with disdain, and swimming to a tree, sat down on a low branch, wondering how ever the poor widow's son could have found his way into fairyland. She did not like it. It was an invasion of privilege. "How did you come here, young Richard?" she asked, from 6 yards off. "A goblin brought me." "Ah, I thought so. A fairy brought me. Where is your fairy?" "Here I am," said Peas Blossom, rising slowly to the surface just by the tree on which Alice was seated. "Where is your goblin?" retorted Alice. "Here I am," bawled Toadstool, rushing out of the water like a salmon, and casting a somersault in the air before he fell in again with a tremendous splash. His head rose again close beside Peas Blossom, who, being used to such creatures, only laughed. "Isn't he handsome?" he grinned. "Yes, very. He wants polishing, though. You could do that for yourself, you know. Shall we change?" "I don't mind. You'll find her rather silly." "That's nothing. The boy's too sensible for me." He dived, and rose at Alice's feet. She shrieked with terror. The fairy floated away like a water lily towards Richard. "What a lovely creature!" thought he, but hearing Alice shriek again, he said, "Don't leave Alice, she's frightened at that queer creature. I don't think there's any harm in him, though, Alice." "Oh, no! He won't hurt her," said Peas Blossom. "I'm tired of her. He's going to take her to the court, and I will take you." "I don't want to go." "But you must. You can't go home again. You don't know the way." "Richard! Richard!" cried Alice, in an agony. Richard sprang from his boat, and was by her side in a moment. "He pinched me!" cried Alice. Richard hit the goblin a terrible blow on the head, but it took no more effect upon him than if his head had been a round ball of india rubber. He gave Richard a furious look, however, and bawling out, "You'll repent that, Dick!" vanished under the water. "Come along, Richard, make haste, he will murder you!" cried the fairy. "It is all your fault," said Richard. "I won't leave Alice." Then the fairy saw it was all over with her and Toadstool, for they can do nothing with mortals against their will. So she floated away across the water in Richard's boat, holding her robe for a sail, and vanished, leaving the two alone in the lake. "You have driven away my fairy!" cried Alice. "I shall never get home now. It is all your fault, you naughty young man." "I drove away the goblin," remonstrated Richard. "Will you please to sit on the other side of the tree? I wonder what my papa would say if he saw me talking to you." "Will you come to the next tree, Alice?" said Richard after a pause. Alice, who had been crying all the time that Richard was thinking, said, "I won't." Richard, therefore, plunged into the water without her, and swam for the tree. Before he had got halfway, however, he heard Alice crying, "Richard! Richard!" This was just what he wanted. So he turned back, and Alice threw herself into the water. With Richard's help she swam pretty well, and they reached the tree. "Now for the next," said Richard, and they swam to the next, and then to the third. Every tree they reached was larger than the last, and every tree before them was larger still. So they swam from tree to tree, till they came to one that was so large that they could not see round it. What was to be done? Clearly to climb this tree. It was a dreadful prospect for Alice, but Richard proceeded to climb, and by putting her feet where he put his, and now and then getting hold of his ankle, she managed to make her way up. There were a great many stumps where branches had withered off, and the bark was nearly as rough as a hillside, so there was plenty of foothold for them. When they had climbed a long time, and were getting very tired indeed, Alice cried out, "Richard, I shall drop, I shall. Why did you come this way?" And she began once more to cry. But at that moment Richard caught hold of a branch above his head, and reaching down his other hand got hold of Alice, and held her till she had recovered a little. In a few moments more they reached the fork of the tree, and there they sat and rested. "This is capital," said Richard cheerily. "What is?" asked Alice sulkily. "Why, we have room to rest, and there's no hurry for a minute or two. I'm tired." "You selfish creature," said Alice. "If you are tired, what must I be?" "Tired too," answered Richard. "But we've got on bravely. And look! What's that?" By this time the day was gone, and the night so near, that in the shadows of the tree all was dusky and dim. But there was still light enough to discover that in a niche of the tree sat a huge horned owl, with green spectacles on his beak, and a book in one foot. He took no heed of the intruders, but kept muttering to himself. And what do you think the owl was saying? I will tell you. He was talking about the book that he held upside down in his foot. "Stupid book this SSS. Nothing in it at all. Everything upside down. Stupid ass SSS. Says owls can't read. I can read backwards. I think that is the goblin again," said Richard in a whisper. "However, if you ask a plain question, he must give you a plain answer, for they are not allowed to tell downright lies in Fairyland." "Don't ask him, Richard, you know you gave him a dreadful blow." "I gave him what he deserved, and he owes me the same. Hullo! Which is the way out?" "He wouldn't say, if you please, because then it would not have been a plain question." "Downstairs," hissed the owl, without ever lifting his eyes from the book, which all the time he read upside down, so learned was he. "On your honor, as a respectable old owl?" asked Richard. "No," hissed the owl, and Richard was almost sure that he was not really an owl. So he stood staring at him for a few moments, when all at once, without lifting his eyes from the book, the owl said, "I will sing a song," and began. "Nobody knows the world but me. When they're all in bed, I sit up to see I'm a better student than students all, for I never read till the darkness fall, and I never read without my glasses, and that is how my wisdom passes. Hallo ho hallo willow. I can see the wind. Now who can do that? I see the dreams that he has in his hat, I see him snorting them out as he goes, out at his stupid old trumpet nose. 10,000 things that you couldn't think, I write them down with pen and ink. Hallo willow wit, that's wit. You may call it learning, 'tis mother wit. No one else sees the Lady Moon sit on the sea, her nest, all night, but the owl, hatching the boats, and the long-legged fowl. When the oysters gape to sing by rote, she crams a pearl down each stupid throat. Hallo wit it, that's wit, there's a fowl!" And so singing, he threw the book in Richard's face, spread out his great, silent, soft wings, and sped away into the depths of the tree. When the book struck Richard, he found that it was only a lump of wet moss. While talking to the owl, he had spied a hollow behind one of the branches. Judging this to be the way the owl meant, he went to see, and found a rude, ill-defined staircase going down into the very heart of the trunk. But so large was the tree that this could not have hurt it in the least. Down this stair, then, Richard scrambled as best he could, followed by Alice, not of her own will, she gave him clearly to understand, but because she could do no better. Down, down they went, slipping and falling sometimes, but never very far, because the stair went round and round. It caught Richard when he slipped, and he caught Alice when she did. They had begun to fear that there was no end to the stair, it went round and round so steadily, when, creeping through a crack, they found themselves in a great hall, supported by thousands of pillars of grey stone. Where the little light came from they could not tell. This hall they began to cross in a straight line, hoping to reach one side, and intending to walk along it till they came to some opening. They kept straight by going from pillar to pillar, as they had done before by the trees. Any honest plan will do in fairyland, if you only stick to it. And no plan will do if you do not stick to it. It was very silent, and Alice disliked the silence more than the dimness, so much, indeed, that she longed to hear Richard's voice. But she had always been so cross to him when he had spoken, that he thought it better to let her speak first, and she was too proud to do that. She would not even let him walk alongside of her, but always went slower when he wanted to wait for her, so that at last he strode on alone. And Alice followed. But by degrees the horror of silence grew upon her, and she felt at last as if there was no one in the universe but herself. The hall went on widening around her. Their footsteps made no noise. The silence grew so intense that it seemed on the point of taking shape. At last she could bear it no longer. She ran after Richard, got up with him, and laid hold of his arm. He had been thinking for some time what an obstinate, disagreeable girl Alice was, and wishing he had her safe home to be rid of her, when, feeling a hand, and looking round, he saw that it was the disagreeable girl. She soon began to be companionable after a fashion, for she began to think, putting everything together, that Richard must have been several times in fairyland before now. "It is very strange," she said to herself. "For he is quite a poor boy, I am sure of that. His arms stick out beyond his jacket like the ribs of his mother's umbrella. And to think of me wandering about fairyland with him!" The moment she touched his arm, they saw an arch of blackness before them. They had walked straight to a door, not a very inviting one, for it opened upon an utterly dark passage. Where there was only one door, however, there was no difficulty about choosing. Richard walked straight through it, and from the greater fear of being left behind, Alice faced the lesser fear of going on. In a moment they were in total darkness. Alice clung to Richard's arm, and murmured, almost against her will, "Dear Richard!" It was strange that fear should speak like love, but it was in fairyland. It was strange, too, that as soon as she spoke thus, Richard should fall in love with her all at once. But what was more curious still was, that, at the same moment, Richard saw her face. In spite of her fear, which had made her pale, she looked very lovely. "Dear Alice," said Richard, "how pale you look! How can you tell that, Richard, when all is as black as pitch? I can see your face. It gives out light. Now I see your hands. Now I can see your feet. Yes, I can see every spot where you are going to. No, don't put your foot there. There is an ugly toad just there." The fact was, that the moment he began to love Alice, his eyes began to send forth light. What he thought came from Alice's face, really came from his eyes. All about her and her path he could see, and every minute saw better, but to his own path he was blind. He could not see his hand when he held it straight before his face, so dark was it. But he could see Alice, and that was better than seeing the way, ever so much. At length Alice too began to see a face dawning through the darkness. It was Richard's face, but it was far handsomer than when she saw it last. Her eyes had begun to give light too, and she said to herself, "Can it be that I love the poor widow's son? I suppose that must be it." She answered herself, with a smile, for she was not disgusted with herself at all. Richard saw the smile, and was glad. Her paleness had gone, and a sweet rosiness had taken its place. And now she saw Richard's path as he saw hers, and between the two sights they got on well. They were now walking on a path betwixt two deep waters, which never moved, shining as black as ebony where the light fell. But they saw ere long that this path kept growing narrower and narrower. At last, to Alice's dismay, the black waters met in front of them. "What is to be done now, Richard?" she said. When they fixed their eyes on the water before them, they saw that it was swarming with lizards, and frogs, and black snakes, and all kinds of strange and ugly creatures, especially some that had neither heads, nor tails, nor legs, nor fins, nor feelers, being, in fact, only living lumps. These kept jumping out and in, and sprawling upon the path. Richard thought for a few moments before replying to Alice's question, as, indeed, well he might. But he came to the conclusion that the path could not have gone on for the sake of stopping there, and that it must be a kind of finger that pointed on where it was not allowed to go itself. So he caught up Alice in his strong arms, and jumped into the middle of the horrid swarm. And just as minnows vanish if you throw anything amongst them, just so these wretched creatures vanished, right and left, and every way. He found the water broader than he had expected, and before he got over, he found Alice heavier than he could have believed, but upon a firm, rocky bottom, Richard waded through in safety. When he reached the other side, he found that the bank was a lofty, smooth, perpendicular rock, with some rough steps cut in it. By and by the steps led them right into the rock, and they were in a narrow passage once more, but this time, leading up. It wound round and round, like the thread of a great screw. At last, Richard knocked his head against something, and could go no farther. The place was close and hot. He put up his hands, and pushed what felt like a warm stone. It moved a little. "Go down, you brutes!" growled a voice above, quivering with anger. "You'll upset my pot and my cat, and my temper too, if you push that way. Go down!" Richard knocked very gently, and said, "Please let us out." "Oh, yes, I dare say. Very fine and soft-spoken. Go down, you goblin brutes! I've had enough of you. I'll scald the hair off your ugly heads if you do that again. Go down, I say!" Seeing fair speech was of no avail, Richard told Alice to go down a little, out of the way, and setting his shoulders to one end of the stone, heaved it up, whereupon down came the other end, with a pot, and a fire, and a cat which had been asleep beside it. She frightened Alice dreadfully as she rushed past her, showing nothing but her green lamping eyes. Richard, peeping up, found that he had turned a hearthstone upside down. On the edge of the hole stood a little crooked old man, brandishing a mop-stick in a tremendous rage, and hesitating only where to strike him. But Richard put him out of his difficulty by springing up and taking the stick from him. Then, having lifted Alice out, he returned it with a bow, and heedless of the maledictions of the old man, proceeded to get the stone and the pot up again. For puss she got out of herself. Then the old man became a little more friendly, and said, "I beg your pardon, I thought you were goblins. They never will let me alone. But you must allow, it was rather an unusual way of paying a morning call." And the creature bowed conciliatingly. "It was, indeed," answered Richard. "I wish you had turned the door to us instead of the hearthstone," for he did not trust the old man. "But," he added, "I hope you will forgive us." "Oh, certainly, certainly, my dear young people. Use your freedom. But such young people have no business to be out alone. It is against the rules. But what is one to do, I mean two to do, when they can't help it? Yes, yes, of course, but now, you know, I must take charge of you. So you sit there, young gentleman, and you sit there, young lady." He put a chair for one at one side of the hearth, and for the other at the other side, and then drew his chair between them. The cat got upon his hump, and then set up her own. So here was a wall that would let through no moonshine. But although both Richard and Alice were very much amused, they did not like to be parted in this peremptory manner. Still they thought it better not to anger the old man any more, in his own house, too. But he had been once angered, and that was once too often, for he had made it a rule never to forgive without taking it out in humiliation. It was so disagreeable to have him sitting there between them, that they felt as if they were far asunder. In order to get the better of the fancy, they wanted to hold each other's hand behind the dwarf's back. But the moment their hands began to approach, the back of the cat began to grow long, and its hump to grow high, and in a moment more, Richard found himself crawling wearily up a steep hill, whose ridge rose against the stars, while a cold wind blew drearily over it. Not a habitation was in sight, and Alice had vanished from his eyes. He felt, however, that she must be somewhere on the other side, and so climbed and climbed to get over the brow of the hill, and down to where he thought she must be. But the longer he climbed, the farther off the top of the hill seemed, till at last he sank quite exhausted, and, must I confess it, very nearly began to cry. To think of being separated from Alice all at once, and in such a disagreeable way. But he fell a thinking instead, and soon said to himself, "This must be some trick of that wretched old man. Either this mountain is a cat or it is not. If it is a mountain, this won't hurt it. If it is a cat, I hope it will." With that, he pulled out his pocket knife, and feeling for a soft place, drove it at one blow up to the handle in the side of the mountain. A terrific shriek was the first result, and the second, that Alice and he sat looking at each other across the old man's hump, from which the cat-a-mountain had vanished. Their host sat staring at the blank fireplace, without ever turning round, pretending to know nothing of what had taken place. "Come along, Alice," said Richard, rising. "This won't do. We won't stop here." Alice rose at once, and put her hand in his. They walked towards the door. The old man took no notice of them. The moon was shining brightly through the window, but instead of stepping out into the moonlight when they opened the door, they stepped into a great beautiful hall, through the high Gothic windows of which the same moon was shining. Out of this hall they could find no way, except by a staircase of stone which led upwards. They ascended it together. At the top Alice let go Richard's hand to peep into a little room, which looked all the colors of the rainbow, just like the inside of a diamond. Richard went a step or two along a corridor, but finding she had left him, turned and looked into the chamber. He could see her nowhere. The room was full of doors, and she must have mistaken the door. He heard her voice calling him, and hurried in the direction of the sound. But he could see nothing of her. "More tricks," he said to himself. "It is of no use to stab this one. I must wait till I see what can be done." Still he heard Alice calling him, and still he followed, as well as he could. At length he came to a doorway, open to the air, through which the moonlight fell. But when he reached it, he found that it was high up in the side of a tower, the wall of which went straight down from his feet, without stair or descent of any kind. Again he heard Alice call him, and lifting his eyes saw her, across a wide castle court, standing at another door just like the one he was at, with the moon shining full upon her. "All right, Alice," he cried. "Can you hear me?" "Yes," answered she. "Then listen. This is all a trick. It is all a lie of that old wretch in the kitchen. Just reach out your hand, Alice dear." Alice did as Richard asked her, and, although they saw each other many yards off across the court, their hands met. "There! I thought so!" exclaimed Richard triumphantly. "Now, Alice, I don't believe it is more than a foot or two down to the court below, though it looks like 100 feet. Keep fast hold of my hand, and jump when I count 3. But Alice drew her hand from him in sudden dismay, whereupon Richard said, "Well, I will try first," and jumped. The same moment his cheery laugh came to Alice's ears, and she saw him standing safe on the ground, far below. "Jump, dear Alice, and I will catch you," said he. "I can't, I am afraid," answered she. "The old man is somewhere near you." "You had better jump," said Richard. Alice sprang from the wall in terror, and only fell a foot or two into Richard's arms. The moment she touched the ground, they found themselves outside the door of a little cottage which they knew very well, for it was only just within the wood that bordered on their village. Hand in hand they ran home as fast as they could. When they reached a little gate that led into her father's grounds, Richard bade Alice good-bye. The tears came in her eyes. Richard and she seemed to have grown quite man and woman in fairyland, and they did not want to part now. But they felt that they must. So Alice ran in the back way, and reached her own room before anyone had missed her. Indeed, the last of the red had not quite faded from the west. As Richard crossed the marketplace on his way home, he saw an umbrella man just selling the last of his umbrellas. He thought the man gave him a queer look as he passed, and felt very much inclined to punch his head. But remembering how useless it had been to punch the goblin's head, he thought it better not. In reward of their courage, the Fairy Queen sent them permission to visit Fairyland as often as they pleased, and no goblin or fairy was allowed to interfere with them. For Peas Blossom and Toadstool, they were both banished from court, and compelled to live together, for 7 years, in an old tree that had just one green leaf upon it. Toadstool did not mind it much, but Peas Blossom did. The shadows. Old Ralph Rinkelmann made his living by comic sketches, and all but lost it again by tragic poems. So he was just the man to be chosen king of the fairies, for in Fairyland the sovereignty is elective. It is no doubt very strange that fairies should desire to have a mortal king, but the fact is, that with all their knowledge and power, they cannot get rid of the feeling that some men are greater than they are, though they can neither fly nor play tricks. So at such times as there happens to be twice the usual number of sensible electors, such a man as Ralph Rinkelmann gets to be chosen. They did not mean to insist on his residence, for they needed his presence only on special occasions. But they must get hold of him somehow, first of all, in order to make him king. Once he was crowned, they could get him as often as they pleased, but before this ceremony there was a difficulty. For it is only between life and death that the fairies have power over grown-up mortals, and can carry them off to their country. So they had to watch for an opportunity. Nor had they to wait long. For old Ralph was taken dreadfully ill, and while hovering between life and death, they carried him off, and crowned him king of Fairyland. But after he was crowned, it was no wonder, considering the state of his health, that he should not be able to sit quite upright on the throne of Fairyland, or that, in consequence, all the gnomes and goblins, and ugly, cruel things that live in the holes and corners of the kingdom, should take advantage of his condition, and run quite wild, playing him, king as he was, all sorts of tricks, crowding about his throne, climbing up the steps, and actually scrambling and quarreling like mice about his ears and eyes so that he could see and think of nothing else. But I am not going to tell anything more about this part of his adventures just at present. By strong and sustained efforts he succeeded, after much trouble and suffering, in reducing his rebellious subjects to order. They all vanished to their respective holes and corners, and King Ralph, coming to himself, found himself in his bed, half propped up with pillows. But the room was full of dark creatures, which gamboled about in the firelight in such a strange, huge, though noiseless fashion, that he thought at first that some of his rebellious goblins had not been subdued with the rest, but had followed him beyond the bounds of Fairyland into his own private house in London. How else could these mad, grotesque hippopotamus calves make their ugly appearance in Ralph Rinkelmann's bedroom? But he soon found out that although they were like the underground goblins, they were very different as well, and would require quite different treatment. He felt convinced that they were his subjects too, but that he must have overlooked them somehow at his late coronation, if indeed they had been present, for he could not recollect that he had seen anything just like them before. He resolved, therefore, to pay particular attention to their habits, ways, and characters, else he saw plainly that they would soon be too much for him, as indeed this intrusion into his chamber, where Mrs. Rinkelmann, who must be queen if he was king, sat taking some tea by the fireside, evidently foreshadowed. But she, perceiving that he was looking about him with a more composed expression than his face had worn for many days, started up, and came quickly and quietly to his side, and her face was bright with gladness. Whereupon the fire burned up more cheerily, and the figures became more composed and respectful in their behavior, retreating towards the wall like well-trained attendants. Then the king of Fairyland had some tea and dry toast, and leaning back on his pillows, nearly fell asleep, but not quite, for he still watched the intruders. Presently the queen left the room to give some of the young princes and princesses their tea, and the fire burned lower, and behold, the figures grew as black and as mad in their gambols as ever. Their favorite games seemed to be hide and seek, touch and go, grin and vanish, and many other such, and all in the king's bedchamber too, so that it was quite alarming. It was almost as bad as if the house had been haunted by certain creatures which shall be nameless in a fairy story, because with them Fairyland will not willingly have much to do. But it is a mercy that they have their slippers on, said the king to himself, for his head ached. As he lay back, with his eyes half shut and half open, too tired to pay longer attention to their games, but, on the whole, considerably more amused than offended with the liberties they took, for they seemed good-natured creatures, and more frolicsome than positively ill-mannered, he became suddenly aware that two of them had stepped forward from the walls, upon which, after the manner of great spiders, most of them preferred sprawling, and now stood in the middle of the floor at the foot of His Majesty's bed, becking and bowing and ducking in the most grotesquely obsequious manner, while every now and then they turned solemnly round upon one heel, evidently considering that motion the highest token of homage they could show. "What do you want?" said the king. "That it may please your Majesty to be better acquainted with us," answered they. "We are your Majesty's subjects." "I know you are." "I shall be most happy," answered the king. "We are not what your Majesty takes us for, though. We are not so foolish as your Majesty thinks us. It is impossible to take you for anything that I know of," rejoined the king, who wished to make them talk, and said whatever came uppermost. "For soldiers, sailors, or anything, you will not stand still long enough. I suppose you really belong to the fire brigade, at least you keep putting its light out. Don't jest, please your Majesty." And as they said the words, for they both spoke at once throughout the interview, they performed a grave somerset towards the king. "Not jest," retorted he. "And with you? Why, you do nothing but jest. What are you?" "The shadows, sire." "And when we do jest, sire, we always jest in earnest. But perhaps your Majesty does not see us distinctly." "I see you perfectly well," returned the king. "Permit me, however," rejoined one of the shadows, and as he spoke he approached the king, and lifting a dark forefinger, he drew it lightly but carefully across the ridge of his forehead, from temple to temple. The king felt the soft gliding touch go, like water, into every hollow, and over the top of every height of that mountain chain of thought. He had involuntarily closed his eyes during the operation, and when he unclosed them again, as soon as the finger was withdrawn, he found that they were opened in more senses than one. The room appeared to have extended itself on all sides, till he could not exactly see where the walls were, and all about it stood the shadows motionless. They were tall and solemn, rather awful, indeed, in their appearance, notwithstanding many remarkable traits of grotesqueness, for they looked just like the pictures of Puritans drawn by cavaliers, with long arms, and very long, thin legs, from which hung large loose feet, while in their countenances length of chin and nose predominated. The solemnity of their mien, however, overcame all the oddity of their form, so that they were very eerie indeed to look at, dressed as they all were in funereal black. But a single glance was all that the king was allowed to have, for the former operator waved his dusky palm across his vision, and once more the king saw only the fire-lighted walls, and dark shapes flickering about upon them. The two who had spoken for the rest seemed likewise to have vanished. But at last the king discovered them, standing one on each side of the fireplace. They kept close to the chimney wall, and talked to each other across the length of the chimney-piece, thus avoiding the direct rays of the fire, which, though light is necessary to their appearing to human eyes, do not agree with them at all, much less give birth to them, as the king was soon to learn. After a few minutes they again approached the bed, and spoke thus. "It is now getting dark, please your Majesty. We mean, out of doors in the snow. Your Majesty may see, from where he is lying, the cold light of its great winding sheet, a famous carpet for the shadows to dance upon, your Majesty. All our brothers and sisters will be at church now, before going to their night's work." "Do they always go to church before they go to work?" "They always go to church first." "Where is the church?" "In Iceland." "Would your Majesty like to see it?" "How can I go and see it, when, as you know very well, I am ill in bed? Besides, I should be sure to take cold in a frosty night like this, even if I put on the blankets, and took the feather bed for a muff." A sort of quivering passed over their faces, which seemed to be their mode of laughing. The whole shape of the face shook and fluctuated as if it had been some dark fluid, till by slow degrees of gathering calm, it settled into its former rest. Then one of them drew aside the curtains of the bed, and the window curtains not having been yet drawn, the king beheld the white glimmering night outside, struggling with the heaps of darkness that tried to quench it, and the heavens full of stars, flashing and sparkling like live jewels. The other shadow went towards the fire and vanished in it. Scores of shadows immediately began an insane dance all about the room, disappearing, one after the other, through the uncovered window, and gliding darkly away over the face of the white snow, for the window looked at once on a field of snow. In a few moments the room was quite cleared of them, but instead of being relieved by their absence, the king felt immediately as if he were in a dead house, and could hardly breathe for the sense of emptiness and desolation that fell upon him. But as he lay looking out on the snow, which stretched blank and wide before him, he spied in the distance a long dark line which drew nearer and nearer, and showed itself at last to be all the shadows, walking in a double row, and carrying in the midst of them something like a bier. They vanished under the window, but soon reappeared, having somehow climbed up the wall of the house, for they entered in perfect order by the window, as if melting through the transparency of the glass. They still carried the bier or litter. It was covered with richest furs, and skins of gorgeous wild beasts, whose eyes were replaced by sapphires and emeralds, that glittered and gleamed in the fire and snow light. The outermost skins sparkled with frost, but the inside ones were soft and warm and dry as the down under a swan's wing. The shadows approached the bed, and set the litter upon it. Then a number of them brought a huge fur robe, and wrapping it round the king, laid him on the litter in the midst of the furs. Nothing could be more gentle and respectful than the way in which they moved him, and he never thought of refusing to go. Then they put something on his head, and lifting the litter carried him once round the room, to fall into order. As he passed the mirror he saw that he was covered with royal ermine, and that his head wore a wonderful crown of gold, set with none but red stones, rubies and carbuncles and garnets, and others whose names he could not tell, glowed gloriously around his head, like the salamandrine essence of all the Christmas fires over the world. A scepter lay beside him, a rod of ebony, surmounted by a cone-shaped diamond, which, cut in 100 facets, flashed all the hues of the rainbow, and threw colored gleams on every side, that looked like shadows too, but more ethereal than those that bore him. Then the shadows rose gently to the window, passed through it, and sinking slowing upon the field of outstretched snow, commenced an orderly gliding rather than march along the frozen surface. They took it by turns to bear the king, as they sped with the swiftness of thought, in a straight line towards the north. The pole star rose above their heads with visible rapidity, for indeed they moved quite as fast as sad thoughts, though not with all the speed of happy desires. England and Scotland slid past the litter of the King of the Shadows. Over rivers and lakes they skimmed and glided. They climbed the high mountains, and crossed the valleys with a fearless bound, till they came to John O'Groat's house and the northern sea. The sea was not frozen, for all the stars shone as clear out of the deeps below as they shone out of the deeps above, and as the bearers slid along the blue-gray surface, with never a froe in their track, so pure was the water beneath that the king saw either surface, bottom, nor substance to it, and seemed to be gliding only through the blue sphere of heaven, with the stars above him, and the stars below him, and between the stars and him nothing but an emptiness, where, for the first time in his life, his soul felt that it had room enough. At length they reached the rocky shores of Iceland. There they landed, still pursuing their journey. All this time the king felt no cold, for the red stones in his crown kept him warm, and the emerald and sapphire eyes of the wild beasts kept the frost from settling upon his litter. Oftentimes upon their way they had to pass through forests, caverns, and rock-shadowed paths, where it was so dark that at first the king feared he should lose his shadows altogether. But as soon as they entered such places, the diamond in his scepter began to shine and glow, and flash, sending out streams of light of all the colors that painter's soul could dream of, in which light the shadows grew livelier and stronger than ever, speeding through the dark ways with an all but blinding swiftness. In the light of the diamond, too, some of their forms became more simple and human, while others seemed only to break out into a yet more untamable absurdity. Once, as they passed through a cave, the king actually saw some of their eyes, strange shadow eyes. He had never seen any of their eyes before. But at the same moment when he saw their eyes, he knew their faces too, for they turned them full upon him for an instant, and the other shadows, catching sight of these, shrank and shivered, and nearly vanished. Lovely faces they were, but the king was very thoughtful after he saw them, and continued rather troubled all the rest of the journey. He could not account for those faces being there, and the faces of shadows, too, with living eyes. But he soon found that amongst the shadows a man must learn never to be surprised at anything, for if he does not, he will soon grow quite stupid, in consequence of the endless recurrence of surprises. At last they climbed up the bed of a little stream, and then, passing through a narrow rocky defile, came out suddenly upon the side of a mountain, overlooking a blue frozen lake in the very heart of mighty hills. Overhead, the aurora borealis was shivering and flashing like a battle of 10,000 spears. Underneath, its beams passed faintly over the blue ice and the sides of the snow-clad mountains, whose tops shot up like huge icicles all about, with here and there a star sparkling on the very tip of one. But as the northern lights in the sky above, so wavered and quivered, and shot hither and thither, the shadows on the surface of the lake below, now gathering in groups, and now shivering asunder, now covering the whole surface of the lake, and anon condensed into one dark knot in the center, every here and there on the white mountains might be seen 2 or 3 shooting away towards the tops, to vanish beyond them. So that their number was gradually, though not visibly, diminishing. "Please your Majesty," said the shadows, "this is our church, the Church of the Shadows." And so saying, the king's bodyguard set down the litter upon a rock, and plunged into the multitudes below. They soon returned, however, and bore the king down into the middle of the lake. All the shadows came crowding round him, respectfully but fearlessly, and sure never such a grotesque assembly revealed itself before to mortal eyes. The king had seen all kind of gnomes, goblins, and kobolds at his coronation, but they were quite rectilinear figures compared with the insane lawlessness of form in which the shadows rejoiced, and the wildest gambols of the former were orderly dances of ceremony beside the apparently aimless and wilful contortions of figure, and metamorphoses of shape, in which the latter indulged. They retained, however, all the time, to the surprise of the king, an identity, each of his own type, inexplicably perceptible through every change. Indeed, this preservation of the primary idea of each form was more wonderful than the bewildering and ridiculous alterations to which the form itself was every moment subjected. "What are you?" said the king, leaning on his elbow, and looking around him. "The shadows, your Majesty," answered several voices at once. "What shadows?" "The human shadows. The shadows of men and women, and their children. Are you not the shadows of chairs and tables, and pokers and tongs, just as well?" At this question a strange jarring commotion went through the assembly with a shock. Several of the figures shot up as high as the aurora, but instantly settled down again to human size, as if overmastering their feelings, out of respect to him who had roused them. One who had bounded to the highest visible icy peak, and as suddenly returned, now elbowed his way through the rest, and made himself spokesman for them during the remaining part of the dialogue. "Excuse our agitation, your Majesty," said he. "I see your Majesty has not yet thought proper to make himself acquainted with our nature and habits." "I wish to do so now," replied the king. "We are the shadows," repeated the shadow solemnly. "Well," said the king, "we do not often appear to men." "Ha!" said the king. "We do not belong to the sunshine at all. We go through it unseen, and only by a passing chill do men recognize an unknown presence." "Ha!" said the king again. "It is only in the twilight of the fire, or when one man or woman is alone with a single candle, or when any number of people are all feeling the same thing at once, making them one, that we show ourselves, and the truth of things." "Can that be true that loves the night?" said the king. "The darkness is the nurse of light," answered the shadow. "Can that be true which mocks at forms?" said the king. "Truth rides abroad in shapeless storms," answered the shadow. "Ha! Ha!" thought Ralph Rinkelmann. "It rhymes. The shadow caps my questions with his answers. Very strange!" And he grew thoughtful again. The shadow was the first to resume. please your Majesty, may we present our petition? By all means, replied the king. I am not well enough to receive it in proper state. Never mind, your Majesty. We do not care for much ceremony, and indeed none of us are quite well at present. The subject of our petition weighs upon us. Go on, said the king. Sire, began the shadow, our very existence is in danger. The various sorts of artificial light, both in houses and in men, women, and children, threaten to end our being. The use and the disposition of gaslights, especially high in the centers, blind the eyes by which alone we can be perceived. We are all but banished from towns. We are driven into villages and lonely houses, chiefly old farmhouses, out of which, even, our friends the fairies are fast disappearing. We therefore petition our king, by the power of his art, to restore us to our rights in the house itself, and in the hearts of its inhabitants. But, said the king, you frighten the children. Very seldom, your Majesty, and then only for their good. We seldom seek to frighten anybody. We mostly want to make people silent and thoughtful, to awe them a little, your Majesty. You are much more likely to make them laugh, said the king. Are we? Said the shadow. And approaching the king one step, he stood quite still for a moment. The diamond of the king's scepter shot out a vivid flame of violet light, and the king stared at the shadow in silence, and his lip quivered. He never told what he saw then, but he would say, just fancy what it might be if some flitting thoughts were to persist in staying to be looked at. It is only, resumed the shadow, when our thoughts are not fixed upon any particular object, that our bodies are subject to all the vagaries of elemental influences. Generally, amongst worldly men and frivolous women, we only attach ourselves to some article of furniture or of dress, and they never doubt that we are mere foolish and vague results of the dashing of the waves of the light against the solid forms of which their houses are full. We do not care to tell them the truth, for they would never see it. But let the worldly man, or the frivolous woman, and then, at each of the pauses indicated, the mass of shadows throbbed and heaved with emotion, but they soon settled again into comparative stillness. Once more the shadow addressed himself to speak. But suddenly they all looked up, and the king, following their gaze, saw that the aurora had begun to pale. The moon is rising, said the shadow. As soon as she looks over the mountains into the valley, we must be gone, for we have plenty to do by the moon. We are powerful in her light. But if your Majesty will come here tomorrow night, your Majesty may learn a great deal more about us, and judge for himself whether it be fit to accord our petition, for then will be our grand annual assembly, in which we report to our chiefs the things we have attempted, and the good or bad success we have had. If you send for me, returned the king, I will come. Ere the shadow could reply, the tip of the moon's crescent horn peeped up from behind an icy pinnacle, and one slender ray fell on the lake. It shone upon no shadows. Ere the eye of the king could again seek the earth after beholding the first brightness of the moon's resurrection, they had vanished, and the surface of the lake glittered gold and blue in the pale moonlight. There the king lay, alone in the midst of the frozen lake, with the moon staring at him. But at length he heard from somewhere a voice that he knew. Will you take another cup of tea, dear? Said Mrs. Wrinkleman. And Ralph, coming slowly to himself, found that he was lying in his own bed. Yes, I will, he answered. And rather a large piece of toast, if you please, for I have been a long journey since I saw you last. He has not come to himself quite, said Mrs. Wrinkleman, between her and herself. You would be rather surprised, continued Ralph, if I told you where I had been. I dare say I should, responded his wife. Then I will tell you, rejoined Ralph. But at that moment, a great shadow bounced out of the fire with a single huge leap, and covered the whole room. Then it settled in one corner, and Ralph saw it shaking its fist at him from the end of a preposterous arm. So he took the hint, and held his peace. And it was as well for him. For I happen to know something about the shadows too, and I know that if he had told his wife all about it just then, they would not have sent for him the following evening. But as the king, after finishing his tea and toast, lay and looked about him, the shadows dancing in his room seemed to him odder and more inexplicable than ever. The whole chamber was full of mystery. So it generally was, but now it was more mysterious than ever. After all that he had seen in the Shadow Church, his own room and its shadows were yet more wonderful and unintelligible than those. This made it the more likely that he had seen a true vision, for instead of making common things look commonplace, as a false vision would have done, it had made common things disclose the wonderful that was in them. The same applies to all arts as well, thought Ralph Rinkelmann. The next afternoon, as the twilight was growing dusky, the king lay wondering whether or not the shadows would fetch him again. He wanted very much to go, for he had enjoyed the journey exceedingly, and he longed, besides, to hear some of the shadows tell their stories. But the darkness grew deeper and deeper, and the shadows did not come. The cause was that Mrs. Rinkelmann sat by the fire in the gloaming, and they could not carry off the king while she was there. Some of them tried to frighten her away by playing the oddest pranks on the walls, and floor, and ceiling, but altogether without effect. The queen only smiled, for she had a good conscience. Suddenly, however, a dreadful scream was heard from the nursery, and Mrs. Rinkelmann rushed upstairs to see what was the matter. No sooner had she gone than the two warders of the chimney corners stepped out into the middle of the room, and said, in a low voice, "Is your Majesty ready?" "Have you no hearts?" said the king. "Or are they as black as your faces? Did you not hear the child scream? I must know what is the matter with her before I go." "Your Majesty may keep his mind easy on that point," replied the warders. "We had tried everything we could think of to get rid of Her Majesty the Queen, but without effect. So a young madcap shadow, half against the will of the older ones of us, slipped upstairs into the nursery, and has, no doubt, succeeded in appalling the baby, for he is very lithe and long-legged. Now, your Majesty, I will have no such tricks played in my nursery," said the king, rather angrily. "You might put the child beside itself. Then there would be twins, your Majesty. And we rather like twins. None of your miserable jesting. You might put the child out of her wits." "Impossible, sire, for she has not got into them yet." "Go away," said the king. "Forgive us, your Majesty. Really, it will do the child good, for that shadow will, all her life, be to her a symbol of what is ugly and bad. When she feels in danger of hating or envying anyone, that shadow will come back to her mind and make her shudder." "Very well," said the king. "I like that. Let us go." The shadows went through the same ceremonies and preparations as before, during which the young shadow before mentioned contrived to make such grimaces as kept the baby in terror, and the queen in the nursery, till all was ready. Then with a bound that doubled him up against the ceiling, and a kick of his legs 6 feet out behind him, he vanished through the nursery door, and reached the king's bedchamber just in time to take his place with the last who were melting through the window in the rear of the litter, and settling down upon the snow beneath. Away they went as before, a gliding blackness over the white carpet. And it was Christmas Eve. When they came in sight of the mountain lake, the king saw that it was crowded over its whole surface with a changeful intermingling of shadows. They were all talking and listening alternately, in pairs, trios, and groups of every size. Here and there large companies were absorbed in attention to one elevated above the rest, not in a pulpit, or on a platform, but on the stilts of his own legs, elongated for the nonce. The aurora, right overhead, lighted up the lake and the sides of the mountains, by sending down from the zenith, nearly to the surface of the lake, great folded vapors, luminous with all the colors of a faint rainbow. Many, however, as the words were that passed on all sides, not a shadow of a sound reached the ears of the king. The shadow speech could not enter his corporeal organs. One of his guides, however, seeing that the king wanted to hear and could not, went through a strange manipulation of his head and ears, after which he could hear perfectly, though still only the voice to which, for the time, he directed his attention. This, however, was a great advantage, and one which the king longed to carry back with him to the world of men. The king now discovered that this was not merely the Church of the Shadows, but their news exchange at the same time. For, as the shadows have no writing or printing, the only way in which they can make each other acquainted with their doings and thinkings is to meet and talk at this word mart and parliament of shades. And as, in the world, people read their favorite authors, and listen to their favorite speakers, so here the shadows seek their favorite shadows, listen to their adventures, and hear generally what they have to say. Feeling quite strong, the king rose and walked about amongst them, wrapped in his ermine robe, with his red crown on his head, and his diamond scepter in his hand. Every group of shadows to which he drew near ceased talking as soon as they saw him approach, but at a nod they went on again directly, conversing and relating and commenting, as if no one was there of other kind or of higher rank than themselves. So the king heard a good many stories. At some of them he laughed, and at some of them he cried. But if the stories that the shadows told were printed, they would make a book that no publisher could produce fast enough to satisfy the buyers. I will record some of the things that the king heard, for he told them to me soon after. In fact, I was for some time his private secretary. I made him confess before a week was over, said a gloomy old shadow. But what was the good of that? Rejoined a pert young one. That could not undo what was done. Yes, it could. What? Bring the dead to life? No, but comfort the murderer. I could not bear to see the pitiable misery he was in. He was far happier with the rope round his neck than he was with the purse in his pocket. I saved him from killing himself too. How did you make him confess? Only by wallowing on the wall a little. How could that make him tell? He knows. The shadow was silent, and the king turned to another, who was preparing to speak. I made a fashionable mother repent. How? Broke from several voices, in whose sound was mingled a touch of incredulity. Only by making a little coffin on the wall, was the reply. Did the fashionable mother confess too? She had nothing more to confess than everybody knew. What did everybody know then? That she might have been kissing a living child, when she followed a dead one to the grave. The next will fare better. I put a stop to a wedding, said another. Horrid shade, remarked a poetic imp. How? Said others. Tell us how. Only by throwing a darkness, as if from the branch of a sconce, over the forehead of a fair girl. They are not married yet, and I do not think they will be. But I loved the youth who loved her. How he started! It was a revelation to him. But did it not deceive him? Quite the contrary. But it was only a shadow from the outside, not a shadow coming through from the soul of the girl. Yes. You may say so. But it was all that was wanted to make the meaning of her forehead manifest, yes, of her whole face, which had now and then, in the pauses of his passion, perplexed the youth. All of it, curled nostrils, pouting lips, projecting chin, instantly fell into harmony with that darkness between her eyebrows. The youth understood it in a moment, and went home miserable. And they're not married yet. I caught a toper alone, over his magnum of port, said a very dark shadow. And didn't I give it him? I made delirium tremens first, and then I settled into a funeral, passing slowly along the length of the opposite wall. I gave him plenty of plumes and mourning coaches. And then I gave him a funeral service, but I could not manage to make the surplice white, which was all the better for such a sinner. The wretch stared till his face passed from purple to grey, and actually left his fifth glass only, unfinished, and took refuge with his wife and children in the drawing-room, much to their surprise. I believe he actually drank a cup of tea, and although I have often looked in since, I have never caught him again, drinking alone at least. But does he drink less? Have you done him any good? I hope so, but I am sorry to say I can't feel sure about it. Humph! 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 Grunted various shadow throats. I had such fun once, cried another. I made such game of a young clergyman. You have no right to make game of anyone. Oh yes, I have, when it is for his good. He used to study his sermons. Where do you think? In his study, of course. Where else should it be? Yes and no, guess again. Out amongst the faces in the streets. Guess again. In still green places in the country? Guess again. In old books? Guess again. No, no, tell us. In the looking-glass. Ha! 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 He was fair game, fair shadow game. I thought so. And I made such fun of him one night on the wall. He had sense enough to see that it was himself, and very like an ape. So he got ashamed, turned the mirror with its face to the wall, and thought a little more about his people, and a little less about himself. I was very glad, for, please your majesty. And here the speaker turned towards the king. We don't like the creatures that live in the mirrors. You call them ghosts, don't you? Before the king could reply, another had commenced. But the story about the clergyman had made the king wish to hear one of the shadow sermons. So he turned him towards a long shadow, who was preaching to a very quiet and listening crowd. He was just concluding his sermon. Therefore, dear shadows, it is the more needful that we love one another as much as we can, because that is not much. We have no such excuse for not loving as mortals have, for we do not die like them. I suppose it is the thought of that death that makes them hate so much. Then again, we go to sleep all day, most of us, and not in the night, as men do. And you know that we forget everything that happened the night before. Therefore, we ought to love well, for the love is short. Ah, dear shadow, whom I love now with all my shadowy soul, I shall not love thee tomorrow eve, I shall not know thee, I shall pass thee in the crowd and never dream that the shadow whom I now love is near me then. Happy shades! For we only remember our tales until we have told them here, and then they vanish in the shadow churchyard, where we bury only our dead selves. Ah, brethren, who would be a man and remember? Who would be a man and weep? We ought indeed to love one another, for we alone inherit oblivion, we alone are renewed with eternal birth, we alone have no gathered weight of years. I will tell you the awful fate of one shadow who rebelled against his nature, and sought to remember the past. He said, I will remember this eve. He fought with the genial influences of kindly sleep when the sun rose on the awful dead day of light, and although he could not keep quite awake, he dreamed of the foregone eve, and he never forgot his dream. Then he tried again the next night, and the next, and the next, and he tempted another shadow to try it with him. But at last their awful fate overtook them, for, instead of continuing to be shadows, they began to cast shadows, as foolish men say, and so they thickened and thickened till they vanished out of our world. They are now condemned to walk the earth, a man and a woman, with death behind them, and memories within them. Ah, brother shades! Let us love one another, for we shall soon forget. We are not men but shadows. The king turned away, and pitied the poor shadows far more than they pitied men. Oh, how we played with a musician one night! Exclaimed a shadow in another group, to which the king had first directed a passing thought, and then had stopped to listen. Up and down we went, like the hammers and dampers on his piano. But he took his revenge on us. For after he had watched us for half an hour in the twilight, he rose and went to his instrument, and played a shadow dance that fixed us all in sound forever. Each could tell the very notes meant for him, and as long as he played, we could not stop, but went on dancing and dancing after the music, just as the magician, I mean the musician, pleased. And he punished us well, for he nearly danced us all off our legs and out of shape into tired heaps of collapsed and palpitating darkness. We won't go near him for some time again, if we can only remember it. He had been very miserable all day, he was so poor, and we could not think of any way of comforting him except making him laugh. We did not succeed, with our wildest efforts, but it turned out better than we had expected, after all, for his shadow dance got him into notice, and he is quite popular now, and making money fast. If he does not take care, we shall have other work to do with him by and by, poor fellow. I and some others did the same for a poor playwright once. He had a Christmas piece to write, and not being an original genius, it was not so easy for him to find a subject as it is for most of his class. I saw the trouble he was in, and collecting a few stray shadows, we acted, in dumb show of course, the funniest bit of nonsense we could think of, and it was quite successful. The poor fellow watched every motion, roaring with laughter at us, and delight at the ideas we put into his head. He turned it all into words, and scenes, and actions, and the piece came off with a splendid success. But how long we have to look for a chance of doing anything worth doing, said a long, thin, especially lugubrious shadow. I have only done one thing worth telling ever since we met last. But I am proud of that. What was it? What was it? Rose from 20 voices. I crept into a dining room, one twilight, soon after Christmas Day. I had been drawn thither by the glow of a bright fire shining through red window curtains. At first I thought there was no one there, and was on the point of leaving the room, and going out again into the snowy street, when I suddenly caught the sparkle of eyes. I found that they belonged to a little boy who lay very still on a sofa. I crept into a dark corner by the sideboard, and watched him. He seemed very sad, and did nothing but stare into the fire. At last he sighed out, "I wish Mamma would come home." Poor boy, thought I, there is no help for that but Mamma, yet I would try to while away the time for him. So out of my corner I stretched a long shadow arm, reaching all across the ceiling, and pretended to make a grab at him. He was rather frightened at first, but he was a brave boy, and soon saw that it was all a joke. So when I did it again, he made a clutch at me, and then we had such fun! For though he often sighed and wished Mamma would come home, he always began again with me, and on we went with the wildest games. At last his mother's knock came to the door, and starting up in delight, he rushed into the hall to meet her, and forgot all about poor black me. But I did not mind that in the least, for when I glided out after him into the hall, I was well repaid for my trouble by hearing his mother say to him, "Why, Charlie, my dear, you look ever so much better since I left you." At that moment I slipped through the closing door, and as I ran across the snow, I heard the mother say, "What shadow can that be, passing so quickly?" And Charlie answered with a merry laugh, "Oh, Mamma, I suppose it must be the funny shadow that has been playing such games with me all the time you were out." As soon as the door was shut, I crept along the wall and looked in at the dining room window. And I heard his mamma say, as she led him into the room, "What an imagination the boy has! Ha! Ha! Ha!" Then she looked at him, and the tears came in her eyes, and she stooped down over him, and I heard the sounds of a mingling kiss and sob. "I always look for nurseries full of children," said another, "and this winter I have been very fortunate. I am sure children belong especially to us." One evening, looking about in a great city, I saw through the window into a large nursery, where the odious gas had not yet been lighted. Round the fire sat a company of the most delightful children I had ever seen. They were waiting patiently for their tea. It was too good an opportunity to be lost. I hurried away, and gathering together 20 of the best shadows I could find, returned in a few moments, and entering the nursery, we danced on the walls one of our best dances. To be sure, it was mostly extemporized, but I managed to keep it in harmony by singing this song, which I made as we went on. Of course the children could not hear it, they only saw the motions that answered to it, but with them they seemed to be very much delighted indeed, as I shall presently prove to you. This was the song: swing, swang, swingle, swuff, flicker, flacka, fling, fluff. Thus we go, to and fro, here and there, everywhere, born and bred, never dead, only gone. On! Come on! Looming, glooming, spreading, fuming, shattering, scattering, parting, darting, settling, starting, all our life is a strife, and a wearying for rest on the darkness' friendly breast. Joining, splitting, rising, sitting, laughing, shaking, sides all aching, grumbling, grim and gruff. Swingle, swangle, swuff. Now a knot of darkness, now dissolved gloom, now a pall of blackness hiding all the room. Flicker, flacker, fluff. Black, and black enough. Dancing now like demons, lying like the dead, gladly would we stop it, and go down to bed. But our work we still must do, shadow men, as well as you. Rooting, rising, shooting, heaving, sinking, creeping, hidden corners crooning, splitting, poking, leaping, gathering, towering, swooning. When we're lurking, yet we're working, for our labor we must do, shadow men, as well as you. Flicker, flacka, fling, fluff. Swing, swang, swingle, swuff. How thick the shadows are, said one of the children, a thoughtful little girl. I wonder where they come from, said a dreamy little boy. I think they grow out of the wall, answered the little girl, for I have been watching them come, first one and then another, and then a whole lot of them. I am sure they grow out of the walls. Perhaps they have papas and mammas, said an older boy, with a smile. Yes, yes, and the doctor brings them in his pocket, said another, a consequential little maiden. No, I'll tell you, said the older boy, they're ghosts. But ghosts are white. Oh, but these have got black coming down the chimney. No, said a curious-looking, white-faced boy of 14, who had been reading by the firelight, and had stopped to hear the little ones talk. They're body ghosts. They're not soul ghosts. A silence followed, broken by the first, the dreamy-eyed boy, who said, I hope they didn't make me, at which they all burst out laughing. Just then the nurse brought in their tea, and when she proceeded to light the gas, we vanished. I stopped a murder, cried another. How? 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 I will tell you. I had been lurking about a sick room for some time, where a miser lay, apparently dying. I did not like the place at all, but I felt as if I should be wanted there. There were plenty of lurking places about, for the room was full of all sorts of old furniture, especially cabinets, chests, and presses. I believe he had in that room every bit of the property he had spent a long life in gathering. I found that he had gold and gold in those places, for one night, when his nurse was away, he crept out of bed, mumbling and shaking, and managed to open one of his chests, though he nearly fell down with the effort. I was peeping over his shoulder, and such a gleam of gold fell upon me, that it nearly killed me. But hearing his nurse coming, he slammed the lid down, and I recovered. I tried very hard, but I could not do him any good. For although I made all sorts of shapes on the walls and ceiling, representing evil deeds that he had done, of which there were plenty to choose from, I could make no shapes on his brain or conscience. He had no eyes for anything but gold. And it so happened that his nurse had neither eyes nor heart for anything else either. One day, as she was seated beside his bed, but where he could not see her, stirring some gruel in a basin, to cool it from him, I saw her take a little phial from her bosom, and I knew by the expression of her face both what it was and what she was going to do with it. Fortunately, the cork was a little hard to get out, and this gave me one moment to think. The room was so crowded with all sorts of things, that although there were no curtains on the four-post bed to hide from the miser the sight of his precious treasures, there was yet but one small part of the ceiling suitable for casting myself upon in the shape I wished to assume. And this spot was hard to reach. But having discovered that upon this very place lay a dull gleam of firelight thrown from a strange old dusty mirror that stood away in some corner, I got in front of the fire, spied where the mirror was, threw myself upon it, and bounded from its face upon the oval pool of dim light on the ceiling, assuming, as I passed, the shape of an old stooping hag, who poured something from a phial into a basin. I made the handle of the spoon with my own nose, ha! Ha! And the shadow hand caressed the shadow tip of the shadow nose, before the shadow tongue resumed. The old miser saw me. He would not taste the gruel that night, although his nurse coaxed and scolded till they were both weary. She pretended to taste it herself, and to think it very good, but at last retired into a corner, and after making as if she were eating it, took good care to pour it all out into the ashes. But she must either succeed, or starve him, at last, interposed the shadow. I will tell you. And, interposed the third, he was not worth saving. He might repent, suggested another who was more benevolent. No chance of that, returned the former. Misers never do. The love of money has less in it to cure itself than any other wickedness into which wretched men can fall. What a mercy it is to be born a shadow! Wickedness does not stick to us. What do we care for gold? Rubbish! Amen! 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 Came from 100 shadow voices. You should have let her murder him, and so you would have been quit of him. And besides, how was he to escape at last? He could never get rid of her, you know. I was going to tell you, resumed the narrator. Only you had so many shadow remarks to make that you would not let me. Go on, go on. There was a little grandchild who used to come and see him sometimes, the only creature the miser cared for. Her mother was his daughter, but the old man would never see her, because she had married against his will. Her husband was now dead, but he had not forgiven her yet. After the shadow he had seen, however, he said to himself, as he lay awake that night, I saw the words on his face, how shall I get rid of that old devil? If I don't eat I shall die, and if I do eat I shall be poisoned. I wish little Mary would come. Ah! Her mother would never have served me so. He lay awake, thinking such things over and over again, all night long, and I stood watching him from a dark corner, till the dayspring came and shook me out. When I came back next night, the room was tidy and clean. His own daughter, a sad-faced but beautiful woman, sat by his bedside, and little Mary was curled up on the floor by the fire, imitating us, by making queer shadows on the ceiling with her twisted hands. But she could not think however they got there. And no wonder, for I helped her to some very unaccountable ones. I have a story about a granddaughter, too, said another, the moment that speaker ceased. Tell it. Tell it. Last Christmas Day, he began, I and a troop of us set out in the twilight to find some house where we could all have something to do, for we had made up our minds to act together. We tried several, but found objections to them all. At last we espied a large lonely country house, and hastening to it, we found great preparations making for the Christmas dinner. We rushed into it, scampered all over it, and made up our minds in a moment that it would do. We amused ourselves in the nursery first, where there were several children being dressed for dinner. We generally do go to the nursery first, Your Majesty. This time we were especially charmed with a little girl about 5 years old, who clapped her hands and danced about with delight at the antics we performed, and we said we would do something for her if we had a chance. The company began to arrive, and at every arrival we rushed to the hall, and cut wonderful capers of welcome. Between times we scudded away to see how the dressing went on. One girl about 18 was delightful. She dressed herself as if she did not care much about it, but could not help doing it prettily. When she took her last look at the phantom in the glass, she half smiled to it. But we do not like those creatures that come into the mirrors at all, Your Majesty. We don't understand them. They are dreadful to us. She looked rather sad and pale, but very sweet and hopeful. So we wanted to know all about her, and soon found out that she was a distant relation and a great favorite of the gentleman of the house, an old man, in whose face benevolence was mingled with obstinacy and a deep shade of the tyrannical. We could not admire him much, but we would not make up our minds all at once. Shadows never do. The dinner bell rang, and down we hurried. The children all looked happy, and we were merry. But there was one cross fellow among the servants, and didn't we plague him? And didn't we get fun out of him? When he was bringing up dishes, we lay in wait for him at every corner, and sprang upon him from the floor, and from over the banisters, and down from the cornices. He started and stumbled and blundered so in consequence, that his fellow servants thought he was tipsy. Once he dropped a plate, and had to pick up the pieces, and hurry away with them, and didn't we pursue him as he went? It was lucky for him his master did not see how he went on, but we took care not to let him get into any real scrape, though he was quite dazed with the dodging of the unaccountable shadows. Sometimes he thought the walls were coming down upon him, sometimes that the floor was gaping to swallow him, sometimes that he would be knocked to pieces by the hurrying to and fro, or be smothered in the black crowd. When the blazing plum pudding was carried in, we made a perfect shadow carnival about it, dancing and mumming in the blue flames, like mad demons. And how the children screamed with delight! The old gentleman, who was very fond of children, was laughing his heartiest laugh, when a loud knock came to the hall door. The fair maiden started, turned paler, and then red as the Christmas fire. I saw it, and flung my hands across her face. She was very glad, and I know she said in her heart, "You kind shadow," which paid me well. Then I followed the rest into the hall, and found there a jolly, handsome, brown-faced sailor, evidently a son of the house. The old man received him with tears in his eyes, and the children with shouts of joy. The maiden escaped in the confusion, just in time to save herself from fainting. We crowded about the lamp to hide her retreat, and nearly put it out, and the butler could not get it to burn up before she had glided into her place again, relieved to find the room so dark. The sailor only had seen her go, and now he sat down beside her, and without a word got hold of her hand in the gloom. When we all scattered to the walls and the corners, and the lamp blazed up again, he let her hand go. During the rest of the dinner the old man watched the two, and saw that there was something between them, and was very angry. For he was an important man in his own estimation, and they had never consulted him. The fact was, they had never known their own minds till the sailor had gone upon his last voyage, and had learned each other's only this moment. We found out all this by watching them, and then talking together about it afterwards. The old gentleman saw, too, that his favorite, who was under such obligation to him for loving her so much, loved his son better than him. And he grew by degrees so jealous that he overshadowed the whole table with his morose looks and short answers. That kind of shadowing is very different from ours, and the Christmas dessert grew so gloomy that we shadows could not bear it, and were delighted when the ladies rose to go to the drawing-room. The gentlemen would not stay behind the ladies, even for the sake of the well-known wine. So the moody host, notwithstanding his hospitality, was left alone at the table in the great silent room. We followed the company upstairs to the drawing-room, and thence to the nursery for snapdragon. But while they were busy with this most shadowy of games, nearly all the shadows crept downstairs again to the dining-room, where the old man still sat, gnawing the bone of his own selfishness. They crowded into the room, and by using every kind of expansion, blowing themselves out like soap bubbles, they succeeded in heaping up the whole room with shade upon shade. They clustered thickest about the fire and the lamp, till at last they almost drowned them in hills of darkness. Before they had accomplished so much, the children, tired with fun and frolic, had been put to bed. But the little girl of 5 years old, with whom we had been so pleased when first we arrived, could not go to sleep. She had a little room of her own, and I had watched her to bed, and now kept her awake by gambling in the rays of the night light. When her eyes were once fixed upon me, I took the shape of her grandfather, representing him on the wall as he sat in his chair, with his head bent down and his arms hanging listlessly by his sides. And the child remembered that that was just as she had seen him last, for she had happened to peep in at the dining-room door after all the rest had gone upstairs. What if he should be sitting there still, thought she, all alone in the dark? She scrambled out of bed and crept down. Meantime the others had made the room below so dark that only the face and white hair of the old man could be dimly discerned in the shadowy crowd. For he had filled his own mind with shadows, which we shadows wanted to draw out of him. Those shadows are very different from us, your Majesty knows. He was thinking of all the disappointments he had had in life, and of all the ingratitude he had met with. And he thought far more of the good he had done than the good others had got. After all I have done for them, said he, with a sigh of bitterness, not one of them cares a straw for me. My own children will be glad when I am gone. At that instant he lifted up his eyes and saw, standing close by the door, a tiny figure in a long nightgown. The door behind her was shut. It was my little friend, who had crept in noiselessly. A pang of icy fear shot to the old man's heart, but it melted away as fast, for we made a lane through us for a single ray from the fire to fall on the face of the little sprite, and he thought it was a child of his own that had died when just the age of her child niece, who now stood looking for her grandfather among the shadows. He thought she had come out of her grave in the cold darkness to ask why her father was sitting alone on Christmas Day. And he felt he had no answer to give his little ghost, but one he would be ashamed for her to hear. But his grandchild saw him now, and walked up to him with a childish stateliness, stumbling once or twice on what seemed her long shroud. Pushing through the crowded shadows, she reached him, climbed upon his knee, laid her little long-haired head on his shoulders, and said, "Grandpa, you gummy? Isn't it your kissy day too, Grandpa?" A new fount of love seemed to burst from the clay of the old man's heart. He clasped the child to his bosom, and wept. Then, without a word, he rose with her in his arms, carried her up to her room, and laying her down in her bed, covered her up, kissed her sweet little mouth unconscious of reproof, and then went to the drawing-room. As soon as he entered, he saw the culprits in a quiet corner alone. He went up to them, took a hand of each, and joining them in both his, said, "God bless you." Then he turned to the rest of the company. "And now," said he, "let's have a Christmas carol." And well he might, for though I have paid many visits to the house, I have never seen him cross since, and I am sure that must cost him a good deal of trouble. We have just come from a great palace, said another, where we knew there were many children, and where we thought to hear glad voices, and see royally merry looks. But as soon as we entered, we became aware that one mighty shadow shrouded the whole, and that shadow deepened and deepened, till it gathered in darkness about the reposing form of a wise prince. When we saw him, we could move no more, but clung heavily to the walls, and by our stillness added to the sorrow of the hour. And when we saw the mother of her people weeping with bowed head for the loss of him in whom she had trusted, we were seized with such a longing to be shadows no more, but winged angels, which are the white shadows cast in heaven from the light of light, so as to gather around her, and hover over her with comforting, that we vanished from the walls, and found ourselves floating high above the towers of the palace, where we met the angels on their way, and knew that our service was not needed. By this time there was a glimmer of approaching moonlight, and the king began to see several of those stranger shadows, with human faces and eyes, moving about amongst the crowd. He knew at once that they did not belong to his dominion. They looked at him, and came near him, and passed slowly, but they never made any obeisance, or gave sign of homage. And what their eyes said to him, the king only could tell. And he did not tell. "What are those other shadows that move through the crowd?" said he to one of his subjects near him. The shadow started, looked round, shivered slightly, and laid his finger on his lips. Then, leading the king a little aside, and looking carefully about him once more, "I do not know," said he in a low tone, "what they are. I have heard of them often, but only once did I ever see any of them before. That was when some of us one night paid a visit to a man who sat much alone, and was said to think a great deal. We saw two of those sitting in the room with him, and he was as pale as they were. We could not cross the threshold, but shivered and shook, and felt ready to melt away. Is not your majesty afraid of them too?" But the king made no answer, and before he could speak again, the moon had climbed above the mighty pillars of the Church of the Shadows, and looked in at the great window of the sky. The shapes had all vanished, and the king, again lifting up his eyes, saw but the wall of his own chamber, on which flickered the shadow of a little child. He looked down, and there, sitting on a stool by the fire, he saw one of his own little ones, waiting to say good night to his father, and go to bed early, that he might rise early too, and be very good and happy all Christmas Day. And Ralph Rinkelmann rejoiced that he was a man, and not a shadow. But as the shadows vanished, they left the sense of song in the king's brain. And the words of their song must have been something like these: "Shadows, shadows, shadows all. Shadow birth and funeral. Shadow moons gleam overhead, over shadow graves we tread. Shadow hope lives, grows, and dies. Shadow love from shadow eyes, shadow word entices on to shadow words on shadow stone, closing up the shadow tale with a shadow wail. Shadow man, thou art a gloom cast upon a shadow tomb through the endless shadow air, from the shadow sitting there, on a moveless shadow throne, glooming through the ages gone, north and south, and in and out, east and west, and all about, flinging shadows everywhere on the shadow-painted air. Shadow man, thou hast no story, nothing but a shadow glory." But Ralph Rinkelmann said to himself, "They are but shadows that sing thus, for a shadow can see but shadows. A man sees a man where a shadow sees only a shadow." And he was comforted in himself. End of Project Gutenberg's Cross Purposes and the Shadows, by George MacDonald.